Transgender. You know, about 15 years ago when I started my research, not many people actually knew what transgender meant. But nowadays it's a hot topic, isn't it? I mean, we've got clashing opinions. On the one hand, people fighting for more gender diversity, and on the other hand, people strongly opposing to that. Now, why is that? And what can we do about that? You see, as a psychologist, me and my colleagues study the influence of stigma on transgender people. And we are actually talking about quite fundamental things here. Because, for instance, what do you think that your parents had the first thing that they wondered about when they knew that you were coming? Well, I think I know what your parents thought, and it was probably something like this. What is it going to be? Is it a boy or a girl? That is the very first and main category that we use to specify people. I mean, it determines the way we talk about them, how we address them, and we see totally different pathways of life before us for a baby boy and a baby girl. And that is because we have this whole set of expectations and roles that we have attached to this. And yet, there is a growing number of people who feel discomfort about the gender that they were assigned at birth. And we call that gender dysphoria, this discomfort. You see, people with gender dysphoria, for them, their birth sex, their biological sex, does not or not completely fit their gender identity. And your gender identity is the internal feeling that you have of being a man or a woman, but it could also be somewhere in between or somewhere outside of that spectrum, and we call that non-binary. Now, can you actually feel your own gender identity? Try it. Because I often compare it with a wisdom tooth, you know. If it fits your body, you hardly feel it. But mind you, you start feeling it when it doesn't fit. And growing up with gender dysphoria is quite a challenge. I mean, think of these fundamental boxes that we have, boy and girl, and you're in a box where you don't fit yourself. I mean, it's sort of a puzzle that you can never solve. Either you are mad or the rest of the world is mad. And you can try to ignore it, but this toothache, it's always there. And there's also stigma to deal with. Because if we cross this line between the two genders, people tend to feel discomfortable with us. We risk negative reactions, exclusion. And these difficulties take a toll. People with gender dysphoria have far more psychological problems than people in general. And that's mainly depression, anxiety, and I think most astounding are the suicide rates. The latest review shows us that about half the people with gender dysphoria have seriously considered suicide at some point of their lives. And almost 30% really attempted it. And that's just the ones that survived. Now, a few things have changed in our understanding of gender dysphoria. And the first is the origin of it. You know, for years we used to think that this was mainly a psychological problem. But recently we know that there is also a biological basis to this. For instance, twin studies show us that the genes have more impact on our gender dysphoria than upbringing does. And there's also the brain. You know, if you look at the brain of men and women, it's mostly the same. But there are some differences. And if you look at the brains of transgender people on these differences, we see that they have more resemblance with their felt birth gender identity than with their birth sex. And we don't completely understand this process yet, but what we do know is that it's not just something that people get in their heads, not just an idea. And another thing that has changed is the way we think about the solution. You know, years ago, people used to think that gender dysphoria could be cured by therapeutic interventions, changing people's mind about their gender identity. And there were psychiatrists who had successful stories of that. Well, I could show you some interviews that we have with elder trans people that were sent to these psychiatrists back then when they were young. And they described the shame that they felt and the hopelessness that they felt in these sessions because they felt they had to change, but they just couldn't. And in the end, all they could do was to say, okay, I think it's over, I'm cured. But their gender identity didn't change, it just went deeper into hiding. You cannot change a person's gender identity by psychotherapy. Now, what you can do is you can adjust the body to fit their inner feelings, and that is now standard treatment protocol. And we've got vast numbers of studies to show that this is usually a great improvement to people's well-being, and that suicide rates go down. And then the third changing element, and that is recent, the last 10 years or so. And that is the amount of information that people have on transgender and gender identity. From these same interviews we did with the elder trans people, we also hear what the impact is of lack of information. People felt that there was something different about them. They felt probably something wrong, but they couldn't label it. And they thought they were the only one in the world who suffered from this. Stories of people going to the library and seeking for information and then quickly hiding the book away when somebody approached. Well, nowadays we've got plenty of information on this topic. We've got transgenders in the media, we've got the social media where people can connect and get into contact with each other, and the internet gives us all the information we need. And that is very important for this group. And this, together with our increase of medical possibilities and our increase of understanding, has now led to also an increase of people who say, okay, I don't fit in this box. I want to search my own gender identity. And that's all good news so far, it seems. But it brings us back, of course, to the question, why is it such a hot topic nowadays? And the answer is rather simple, really. We are in a very fundamental shift as society. And if there is a shift in society, it influences everybody, and also the people who never asked for this shift. So it's not really surprising that we now hear the voices of groups that really don't like the changes that are happening, strong religious groups, conservative groups. And the real question then is, how can we handle this? Well, let's have a look at this young boy on the shoulder of his mother. You see, this is my son on top. And the mother, that's me. And about 17 years ago, our life got quite mixed up. Because his father, my husband, he got ill. And he died. And the boy was 11 years at that time. And after my husband's death, I came to realize that I would probably be a far better parent for him, but especially a far happier person as well, if I could allow myself to become what I really felt inside, a man. But you can understand my hesitation, especially towards him. I mean, the boy just lost his father. And I always knew that if he couldn't take it, I would have to wait. And then at some point I decided, okay, the time is right. I have to tell him. So I told him about my gender identity feelings. Well, of course he was flabbergasted. And of course he thought it was a ridiculous idea. I mean, he would have no such thing. Not now, not later. I need you as a grandmother for my future children. And of course I understood perfectly. And then, the next day, he went off to school. And he shouted at his friend across the street, "Hey, you know what my mother is going to do? She wants to have a sex change." And they drove off to school and they told the whole schoolyard about this. Now, that was not exactly the coming out that I had in mind for the neighborhood. But you know, at the same time, I realized this was very good news. Because he was open about it, he did not feel ashamed, and he generated his own support. And when he came home, I told him I was very proud of this openness. I also told him that I would probably take this step at some point in my life, but I would always consider his feelings in that as well. And he would never lose me, you know. We would stay connected. And then, a few months later, he told me he was okay with it. You know, he even began to see the advantages of this. Making the blitz at school with his mother, who's also a man. And he has been okay with it since. And he's 27 by now. And he still calls me mum. Yes, in public as well. So that leads to hilarious situations, and we both enjoy that. So, what does this show us about the acceptance of change? Well, for one, rejection is very normal at first. And we also see that in the interviews that we do with relatives and partners of transgender people. Even the ones who want to be very supportive and who feel they just want to support their kin. But before and during transition, they very often experience a sense of loss. You know, mourning over the dreams they had for this daughter that now is no daughter anymore. They never asked for this change. And they experience what we call ambiguous loss. And that is where you, on the one hand, you feel loss, and on the other hand, you feel you are not entitled to this. And the worst thing that you can do in such a situation is to discard one of those feelings. Because it doesn't go away. It just goes deeper underground. So, whenever people are in this struggle, we advise them to be open to both feelings, to accept them both as valid and real. And I think that is what we need to do in society as well. Because yes, the broadening of these gender boundaries is extremely important for people who get suffocated by them. And yes, other people feel the loss of values that they feel comfortable with. So let's be respectful and let's open ourselves to both feelings that people have. And let's connect, both on the individual and on the societal level. And that is my advice for a smoother process of change, both as a psychologist and as a mother and as a man. Thank you.